Good morning, everybody, and thanks for that introduction. I'm Nancy Ryan, and I spent many years working at the California Public Utilities Commission, and now I'm an independent consultant, and I work with both the auto industry and the commercial transportation industry, principally advising them on how to work with public utility commissions. So my work today is really right at the intersection of utility policy and transportation electrification. What I will cover is some background first on transportation electrification. Then I'll get into the kind of key things you need to know for planning, how transportation electrification loads are different than other types of loads, and some of the grid impacts of EV charging, and some approaches to manage the impact of EV charging load and to plan for EV charging load. So the first thing is, let's just get a sense of the landscape. So vehicles are classified based on weight. The Class 1A, 1 and 2A are the familiar light-duty vehicles, cars, pickups, light pickups, minivans. Classes 2B through 5 are what is known as medium-duty vehicles, and those are things like delivery vans and box trucks. And then the heavy-duty class 6 through 8, are all the, sort of the big trucks that you see, everything from the semis hauling containers on the highway to fire trucks, garbage trucks, tow trucks, and most types of buses. So I'll talk a little bit about the market for each of these types of vehicles. The market for light-duty vehicles has been steadily growing over the last 15 years since the first Tesla Model S and Chevy Bolt and Nissan Leafs arrived here or rolled off the assembly line. There's been steady growth. It's slowed in the last couple of years, and I think is very much affected by the current uncertainty. I'll say more about that later, but is generally forecasted to grow, and EVs are, expected to eventually, sometime, but by the end of this decade, become lower cost to purchase. Today, most of them, in most places, already have a lower cost of lifetime ownership. And so you see, this is from an Edison Electric Institute report where this is their projection of growth of light-duty EV sales through 2035. So anticipate pretty steady growth. So the market for light-duty EVs is not confined to states that have adopted California's zero-emission vehicle regulations. While most of the top 10 states that have the highest EV penetration are ZEV states, you see that in the kind of the top 25, there are some big states like Florida, Georgia, Texas, Illinois, which are, showing growing market shares and substantial market shares. So I think that's important to understand, that you don't have to be in a ZEV state to be concerned about EV charging load. If we look at the heavy duty, let's turn now to looking at heavy duty vehicles. So the thing to understand about medium and heavy-duty vehicles is, first of all, there are a lot fewer of them than there are light-duty vehicles. The annual sales are much smaller than for light-duty vehicles, but they drive a lot more miles, and they generate a lot more pollution and carbon emissions. And the impact of heavy-duty vehicles, so again, like the kind of the semi-rigs that you see hauling containers on the highway, they have a disproportionate impact because although they account for about 40% of the stock, they drive about 65% of the miles, and they contribute about 75% of the CO2 because not only are they driving more miles, but they're hauling heavier loads. So they have been a major area of concern for regulators. That said, at this point, they are kind of, particularly the long-haul tractors are a little further out in the adoption cycle. The way you want to, and this is very important for planning, the way you want to think about the evolution of charging loads, particularly for the medium and heavy-duty commercial vehicles, is that there will be a progression of use cases and vehicle types that will become commercially feasible. That will vary to some extent geographically based upon electricity rates and availability of capacity that utilities can offer. So that's a key takeaway from this talk. So what you can see here is that the cargo vans are really they are here today, electric cargo vans. I see them driving up and down my street every day delivering packages, and I see some nodding heads. The other thing that's interesting is that the bottom here, I'm sorry. At the bottom there are yard tractors. Those are Class 8 trucks. Those are the same tractors that haul containers down the highway, but they're hauling containers very short distances where they're close to people. So from ports to distribution warehouses, and they've also been a focus of both early policy and efforts to make the economics pencil out. Okay. So again, this is not this adoption of zero emission trucks is not confined to California, although California clearly leads. That's the top bar. You can see that green are the cargo vans, and then the other colors are all the different types of trucks. So most of the other kinds of trucks are being deployed in California, many of them at the ports, which are major air pollution hotspots. But the second and third states are Texas and Florida. So again, good rates, often more capacity available on the grid. So early adopter states for these for cargo vans today. Okay, so let me say a little bit about the industries, the structure of the industry, and I think we're probably all learning a lot more about it right now with all the media coverage of the tariffs that have illustrated the expanse of the supply chains for these vehicles, and also quite a bit of diversity across manufacturers for when and how they build their vehicles. So light duty vehicles, mainly a consumer good, 15 million cars and light trucks sold annually, about 20% of them to fleets. Medium and heavy duty vehicles, corporate fleets buy those, and they are only about 500,000 of those are sold annually in the US. And I'll talk more about the drivers, but I'll mention that it's a highly cyclical market. It has been in a downturn for a while. It could be really crushed based on what happens with the tariffs, since a lot of them are hauling consumer goods that entered the ports from China or other countries. So it's going to be an interesting ride in this industry for at least the next several months. These are also, both industries are very low margin with very long product development cycles, and these are global enterprises, and they're very influenced by regulation and industrial policy in China and in Europe. And again, I think all of that is very much highlighted by a lot of the coverage related to the tariffs. So that said, there are a number of forces driving transportation electrification. Environmental regulation, which also is in flux, is clearly a leading factor. But there's also been a lot of public and utility investment, public investment at both the state and the federal level. Many corporations, in efforts to improve their carbon footprint, have turned to electrification. Walmart and their fleets, Amazon and their fleets, everything from the long-haul tractors to the delivery vans. Then these global market forces cannot be underestimated. Many people, once they buy EVs, they love them and they don't go back. The Wall Street Journal likes to talk about the few people who did go back, but there's a lot more that didn't go back. And then increasingly, as use cases become commercialized, you will see more and more adopted, just because, particularly in the commercial sector, because they are cheaper to own and operate. So I'm going to move quickly through regulation because, again, this is very much in flux. But California regulates both the light duty and the medium and heavy duty sectors. They have in place two regulations, Advanced Clean Cars 2 for light duty vehicles, and Advanced Clean Trucks for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Under the Clean Air Act, there's a provision that other states can adopt California's regulations in lieu of the federal regulations. And as you can see from the green states on the map, many states have done that, many of them Western states. Whether this will continue is up in the air. Congress is doing something now. Even as I speak, and there's further efforts afoot at EPA, but California, I can guarantee, and most of these other states, their riposte is see you in court. So we'll see how this all plays out. Meanwhile, at the state level, there's been plenty of funding approved by utilities. Much of it is to pay for charging infrastructure. Sometimes there are also programs that will offer customers, well, even for customers who buy a car, offer them a level 2 charger. I think the state of Illinois actually puts money on the hood, so provides rebates to people who buy electric cars. Outside of California, the big player has definitely been the federal government with the investments approved in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I can tell you that there is, frenzy lobbying going on to preserve that money. And again, we'll see what happens. So that's all up in the air. But there's been a really historic investment in the charging infrastructure, particularly along corridors, to support the mobility of individual consumers as well as the electrification of medium and heavy duty fleets. So with regard to, let's now talk about the demand side, and particularly demand for fleets. So, while buying a car or a pickup, if that's or a minivan, is often kind of can be, oh, this is much better. Can be kind of an emotional experience, or it's really about, who I am and my identity. Fleet purchase considerations are about three things. First is, can the vehicle do the job? And that's been the big question for years with medium and heavy duty vehicles. And, more and more of them can do the job. And the second question is, how does the total cost of ownership, so the lifetime value proposition, how does that pencil out relative to the conventional alternative? And again, there will be a progression of improvement there, primarily driven by improvements in batteries, energy density. And then the third question, which is really germane for the people in this room, is, can I get the power? So I've decided the truck can do the job, the TCO is favorable, and now can the utility get power to my depot in a timely way? So that's really the question that is relevant for us. So something that I want to convey to all of you is this is, actually, let me go back to this. The chart in this slide comes from a report that several people, I think primarily from DOE and NREL, worked on, that just traces out the sort of progression over time through 2036 of when different use cases are expected to become cost effective, and then the CO2 reductions associated with them. And the, I think, really important thing to take away from this report is that when an end use becomes cost effective, so when the TCO pencils out relative to the conventional alternative, you will see a rapid hockey stick style of pattern of adoption. So the yellow in these slides is the number of zero emission trucks for this particular vehicle class that's been examined here. The columns are different scenarios, but what you see is just like this super fast adoption until they get to the saturation point for for that particular end case. So, even in this 2036 timeframe, not all electrified technologies are going to be able to do every job, but they will be able to do a lot more jobs, and that will happen very fast. And that's why grid planners need to be on their toes and be looking out, 5, 10, 15 years for when this happens, to be ready. Okay, turning to personal transportation, this also could have a hockey stick curve. Again, the decision is somewhat more complicated. This slide just offers an example from a report I worked on for NYSERDA a few years back, where we were looking at the cost and benefits of EV adoption for light-duty vehicles in 3 different parts of New York. So the New York metro area on the left, Long Island in the middle, and upstate. So, upstate's more rural, a few cities, but far apart. And what's interesting here is like this contrast, this is from the driver's perspective. So the economics from, my point of view is I'm thinking about buying an EV, and the net benefit when I consider the incremental cost of the vehicle relative to conventional vehicle, and the impact on my electricity bills, and compare that to my gasoline cost, the tax credits is that in the New York metro area, you would still lose money at the time we did this study. But on Long Island, where rates were lower and more miles are driven, and particularly upstate, where rates are much, much lower and even more miles are driven, then you have a favorable net benefit from the driver perspective. So it's very much a story of where I live, how much I drive, how much I pay for electricity. And so that's something to think about in the context of your state, or for particular utilities whose applications you're looking at. Are they more urban or more rural? Okay, so turning to the impacts of EVs on the grid, I think the important thing to understand is that the impacts can be felt all up and down the distribution system, from the tendrils of the residential distribution grid all the way to the interconnection with the bulk power system. It's kind of a long-term time frame where we would expect to see transportation have anything like the impacts on electricity generation needs that data centers are representing right now. So the impacts are really primarily at the distribution and subtransmission level, but will ultimately contribute to load growth over the long run. But it's really the distribution impacts that we need to be focused on today. So for light duty loads, thinking about those tendrils of the distribution system, adding a level 2 charger and an EV to a house can double the house's load, the premises load. And the adoption of EVs, customers buying EVs, is largely invisible to the utility. There are tools, and I think Chris talked about some of them yesterday, where you can sort of simulate or project with various types of models where and when those loads might occur, but it's really something that's kind of more like a modeling exercise. And the factors that you need to consider are, for your state, are sort of when and where do I think these loads will occur? What tools is the utility using? SIME, LoadSeer, there are various ones where there are ways to integrate assumptions about EV adoption into those models. The other thing is that, particularly in my home state, California, the regulators are counting very heavily on the idea that vehicle to grid, so actual bidirectional vehicles discharging to the grid, can be a really big resource to balance solar. I think it's a big open question. And the overall adoption of, sort of more generally what's called vehicle to everything, that exploits bidirectional capabilities in vehicles, which are becoming more common. I think the jury's still out on how pervasive adoption of that will ultimately be. For medium and heavy duty loads, I think the most important thing to bear in mind about medium and heavy duty loads is that trucks are industrial equipment. Buses are effectively industrial equipment. They exist to do a job, and completing the job on time and at the lowest possible cost is the driving or the paramount consideration. Very few of these vocations are amenable to any significant amount of load management by the utility. I think Andy will talk more about load management for light duty vehicles, but most of those vehicles are parked most of the time, and there's a lot of opportunity to move charging around to spread fixed costs, spread the grid's fixed costs over the recovery of those costs over more hours. So that's great. It's really mostly not true for medium and heavy duty vehicles. There are other aspects of flexibility, and I'll come to that. There are a few examples of like school buses, which are the ideal case for vehicle to grid. I'll say more about that later too. But by and large, this is not a very flexible resource in the common sense in which we think about it. Okay, so I'll say more about that, but let me turn to sort of generally the notion of vehicle grid integration. So on this slide, in the blue box, is a definition from a recent DOE report, which I think is a pretty good general definition of VGI. So it means integrating EVs with the electricity system in a way that supports affordable and reliable charging for drivers and enables a reliable, resilient, and affordable electric grid for all electricity customers. So that's really critical, is that it has to work for drivers and for customers. And I will say, work with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which is the trade association for the legacy automakers. We published a VGI white paper last year and basically said the same thing. Successful vehicle grid integration means it works for drivers and it works for all utility customers. So this industry gets it for sure. So there are a variety of tactics. Andy will talk more about them. Tactics for managing load, again, especially for light-duty vehicles. And then, over the course of these 2 days, you'll hear some about some of the new planning approaches. Again, I think Chris talked largely about this yesterday, but there's, new data sources available, which I'll talk about. New planning approaches being explored in California and New York. I think maybe also in Colorado and Washington are things soon to be adopted. This one seems like it's running out of gas too. Okay. Anyway, there are lots of pilots and some mass market rates and managed charging programs, which again, Andy will talk about. So managed charging, I think of that as both what's referred to as active managed charging, where the customer is actively responding to a price signal, versus passive managed charging, where the customer's charging is being managed by a third party. There's, again, a variety of approaches to this, and the key question for regulators here is, are we getting the shift that we need at the scale that we need, and to spread fixed costs out over this increased number of kWh kilowatt hour sales. And there are approaches where the focus is the bulk power system, where peak shaving, we want to use more of our surplus solar, or the focus may be much more narrow, geographically targeted approaches to resolve peaks on distribution feeders. So a lot of different approaches. Okay, again, medium and heavy duty, different story. Managed charging is really not viable for most fleets. It just doesn't pencil out. I mean, if you can save 40 cents on your bill by avoiding charging, but then the truck can't haul a load in the next hour, you lose $1,000 in revenue. That just doesn't pencil out. So flexibility really comes across more for these fleets in terms of how do they squeeze as many miles of driving essentially out of the capacity that the utility is able to give them, or even if the utility can give them lots of capacity for the sum of all the connected loads of all their vehicles charging at once, is that necessary? Can we reduce the amount of capacity that's needed to serve a site by optimizing across charging with the existing charging cycles that are sufficient to serve that fleet? And I was at the Advanced Clean Transportation Expo in Anaheim, and a huge number of the exhibitors had very fancy systems to optimize charging. I mean, and these are based upon systems that are already in use to optimize availability of drivers, the miles of the trucks. I mean, it works if I hold it to my lips. Yeah, if that one's got more juice. Okay, so yeah, anyway, there are a lot of solutions where they can squeeze a lot of miles, essentially miles out of the available capacity. And I think, which makes it also possible for utilities to optimize the amount of capacity that's provided, and also provide kind of bridging solutions where they may ultimately need 5 megawatts at the site, but today only 1 megawatt is available, and they haven't fully electrified the fleet, but with these kinds of solutions they can get going. So I think this is, again, something you should be asking your utilities about, and they in turn should be asking their fleet customers about. So I mentioned that vehicle to X, or V2X, vehicle to everything. To me, that's really a wild card. There have been lots of pilots and demos, mainly with light duty vehicles. They can generate more valuable grid services than just through standard one-way charging because of that up and down. It's basically just, from the point of view of the grid, it's a bigger battery. California law lets energy regulators, gives them the authority to mandate that new EVs are bidirectionally equipped, that hasn't happened yet. The auto industry strenuously pushed back about that, while at the same time, they do see this as potentially adding this capability to vehicles as potentially valuable to customers, and want to have the option to provide this equipment on their vehicles, and the option for customers to capture savings on their power bill from selling services this way. So this is all, export tariffs and interconnection rules are, critically, they're foundational to be able to capture this resource. Today, the focus is pretty much entirely on supplying backup power to homes, but it's an interesting application. And again, in the commercial sector, the place that we're actually seeing it, and it's being done at scale in some places, is with school bus fleets. In Oakland, California, where I live, the entire school bus fleet has been converted to electric, and they have a V2G depot. So very interesting development. Okay, so I want to go back and talk a little bit more about something that I started talking about, which is, again, strategies to manage load at commercial customer sites that, either, they may be long-term solutions if they pencil out when, the utility can provide the capacity. Today, we mainly see them being deployed as a way to get started electrifying a fleet at a site when the utility has a longer time horizon to provide the necessary capacity that they would really like to have at scale. So on the left side here is I think this is actually a rendering of a site that Greenlane has actually now built and opened in Colton, California. So Greenlane their business model is to provide charging hubs along highway systems that can serve freight. They're aiming to electrify the corridor between the big ports of Long Beach and LA and Phoenix, so that section of I-10. And they opened their first charge hub at the intersection of I-10 and I-215. So, major nexus in the California transportation network. And as you can see, they've got solar canopies there. They've got integrated batteries there, and they're doing as much as they can to squeeze as much traffic or serve as much traffic as they can with the power that, in this case, the Colton Municipal Utility was able to give them. And it's not unusual. You can see the right-hand side is a rendering of a Tesla Supercharger Plaza with 160 stalls. And I think they're even, 160 stalls or more with 250 kW chargers. So each charger would be 250 kW. At the Greenlane facility, I think the chargers are now 400 to 600 kW, but at this trade show, it's just at what's called the megawatt standard charger was introduced. So that will enable a truck to take one, draw power at a megawatt rate, so they can pop in, charge, and get going. Greenlane is basically a public facility. I think anybody can drive in and use it. There are a host of other actors building charge hubs and for different types of end uses, and some of them are really behind the gate. So it's like kind of the traditional card lock system for fueling diesel trucks, and so, or you may have your fleet has a contract with the hub operator. I brought with me some of the literature I picked up at this conference, and I left it in my room, but I'll bring it back at lunchtime if anybody's curious to learn about some of these business models, but they're pretty interesting. And again, the important thing to understand as a regulator, particularly if you're making rules, is that they're really different business, because the business models differ so much, one size really doesn't fit all. And the incentive for these charge hub operators is to utilize their equipment, the investment in the chargers they put on there, as much as possible and serve as much throughput as possible. So, and that, I think, really coincides with what we want them to do with the, any capacity that the utility builds. So it may take some time for them to reach that point, but that's what their economics look like. All right, I'm going to make a quick detour because I was asked to talk about this after the first time I gave this presentation. So a lot of people ask, okay, well, what about second use EV batteries, like in using them as stationary storage? Because by the time an EV kind of comes to, at least, comes to the end of its life as a second, third, generation used car, there may still really be quite a lot of capacity left in that battery. I had one guy ask me, why can't I take the battery out of my Tesla and, turn it into a Tesla Powerwall in my garage? And so my answer to that is that there are some examples where batteries are harvested from vehicles. That's photograph in the top right-hand corner is I think it's in Europe, it's Mobility House, which is an example of a company that provides kind of fleet optimization services. So this would be essentially a bunch of used EV batteries kind of gang together to serve as one giant storage unit, which might be used to help balance the load of fleets that are charging. But by and large, the direction seems to be much more either recycle the materials or find some other way to take the cells out and package them up again. The batteries that are in cars and trucks are, first of all, they're kind of squished together as much as possible to fit the form factor of that vehicle. They're also packaged up with a battery management system and ruggedized to, be able to survive the rigors of driving, in the case of a truck, hundreds of thousands of miles. So in many instances, it's really much, much more cost effective to recycle. And the recycling businesses that are emerging are really able to get, I think over 90% of the critical minerals and an increasingly large percent of the lithium that's in these batteries. So I think that's really probably more promising. But I think another takeaway from this is there are no 100% solutions, for, either for individual use cases or for what happens to batteries. The, transportation sector is so diverse that there will always be trucks or buses that, are not, because of how they work and where they work, they may not be suitable to electrify, and they may be the, the vehicles that, end up using the, available renewable diesel or renewable natural gas. Similarly, there will always be some instances, there will probably always, or in our lifetimes, be some instances where, it makes sense to harvest batteries and, and it pencils out. So I think never say never is what I would say. Okay. So going back to some of the strategies, again, to deal with instances where grid capacity is tight, where, in California, I think this is less true in other states, but in California, it can take, 6, 8, 10 years to go through all the steps of planning, permitting, and constructing new grid infrastructure, particularly when you're talking about places like the fleets that are the ports that are and many of the logistical hubs, which are already in densely populated and highly developed areas. So again, a lot of creativity is going into clever hardware and software solutions. So this is an example of a hub that a company called Prologis built at a location called Dinker, it's Dinker Hub, which is in Torrance, California, and it's right near the two big ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. I think it mainly serves drayage trucks, which are either moving containers around the port, like from where it comes off the boat to where it gets on the train, or maybe moving it to a warehouse somewhere nearby. So these ports operate 24/7. Again, the incentive is to squeeze as many miles per day out of these drayage trucks as you can, and they come to the Dinker Hub to charge, and the goal is to get them back on the road again as fast as possible. So LADWP told Prologis, well, we can't give you any power. So Prologis said, well, we can't go anywhere else because this is where the port is. This is where the trucks are, and the trucks need to move and work as much as possible. So what Prologis did was they put in linear generators, and I think also a lot of battery storage. So they basically just built their own microgrid, and they're serving the trucks with that. Unless it is super expensive to build a grid capacity, I don't think this is a long-run solution. But it's a great interim solution in the sense that, these assets, the linear generators, and, to some extent, the big batteries, they can move somewhere else after the capacity comes to this site. So you can kind of have this steady turnover. So those are not assets that will be stranded. Those are assets that will be used and reused. And obviously, it's not great if you're, if the reason that you have the California has its advanced clean trucks mandate is because they are trying to clean up the air. So it's not great to be running a linear generator to put energy into your so-called zero-emission vehicle trucks. Some of these companies do run on renewable natural gas, but not all of them do. So anyway, so this is another factor to consider. I'll also mention Prologis is an interesting company. If you drive around and you drive by one of the big distribution hubs, I just drove from Oakland out to Stockton in the Central Valley the other day, and there was I feel like they popped up like mushrooms. There's so many of these warehouses along this particular section, and most of those warehouses are serving, they're probably regional haul trucks coming in, bringing the goods, which are then put in, more, trucks that go right to the store or to people's houses. And I think every other building there had Prologis' logo on it. And what's interesting about that is Prologis, they call themselves a landlord. Like, that's what they are. They're a real estate company. They build these warehouses, some of them they will electrify, and then the fleets rent them. So that means if they electrify a warehouse or the capacity gets built to the warehouse, and the fleet that's renting it now isn't ready to electrify, they'll probably go somewhere else. And, a fleet that's eager to electrify is going to come to that spot. So again, kind of understanding these business models is really critical to making sure that the utilities serve these loads well. And for trucks, there's great data. So again, I've kind of tried to stress that where the power needs can be are to a large extent, at least in a macro sense, predictable, because they're going to be overlaid on the existing transportation infrastructure. And here's a great example of that. So this is the intersection of the I-15 and I-10 freeways in Southern California and what we call the Inland Empire. And the orange circle is around the Ontario airport. So this is an example of an airport where a lot of freight comes in. And then it goes to these warehouses, a lot of it in, so basically drayage trucks. And then it leaves those warehouses. And, some of it gets on a long haul truck and drives across the country. But a lot of it goes to, a Walmart distribution center nearby or an Amazon distribution center where it goes to people's homes. And so we know where, in many instances, we know where fleets are located, where fleets congregate. And we also have good information about what kinds of vehicles congregate in those places. And I will add, we also know a lot about, or have the ability to know a lot about what those fleets do. So these red dots that are overlaid on the map I just showed you come from Daimler Truck, which is one of the largest. They serve, They have a 40% market share in U.S. Class 8 trucks. So this is just looking at the Class 8 trucks that domicile out of these facilities. And the dots are based upon the telematics data from those trucks. So, most of us, when we think about telematics, we think about like the GM OnStar, and, so you pay some money and then, they know where your car is and they can come help you. I think that they had ads like that. But telematics are, and telematics are interesting in light duty fleets, but for medium and heavy duty fleets, they're really interesting because they are extensively used today. This data is extensively used today. Their whole business is built around it to optimize the fleet operations. And so we know for conventional trucks, certainly by class, and I think also often by vocation, where they stop, how long they stay there, how many miles they drive every day, how much they're carrying, what kind of miles per gallon they're getting. So all of that can be translated into what kind of chart, how much electricity would they need to carry those same, haul that same stuff on the patterns in which they operate today. And how long they stay tells us the level of charging, that they would need, the capacity. Do they need, 100, 600 megawatt, kW or a megawatt charger? So we know a lot. And so EPRI has developed their EVs to Scale program, which has a tool called eRoadmap, where they have gone around and gotten this kind of data on an anonymized basis from all of the major truck OEMs and many of the fleets. and developed this very expansive database that, obviously it doesn't have every load in it, but provides a very good picture of how trucks drive today and where they stop and how long they stay. That again is really a pretty strong basis to predict the needs for electrification as you then kind of overlay different profiles for the rate at which different vocations would electrify. So if you aren't familiar with this tool, I really urge you to find out about it. EPRI is very happy to give briefings on it. They started off by including energy needs, but they have added for at least 10 big utilities. They've added capacity needs, and they're continuing to develop that across the country. So great tool. And I'll note that I think I heard from EPRI that there's about a dozen states in which analyses based on this tool have been entered into rate cases. And I don't think any of them have been settled yet. One that resolved yet is what I mean. One that may be resolved this summer is Southern California Edison's 2025 general rate case. So, and there was some e-roadmap data projected in there. Again, Edison is, they sit they serve one of the ports, the Port of Long Beach, and then, the distribution hub I showed you. It's really kind of a huge percentage of the freight that crisscrosses the U.S. passes through Edison service territory. So it's critically important in this rate case, and we'd be really interested, to see what they do. Okay, so let me close with, some actions that states can take. I think those of you who work at public utility commissions, can give utilities guidance on how to develop scenario planning methods. There have been concerns expressed in that Edison rate case I talked about regarding the transparency of this EV roadmap data. My opinion is this data is too valuable not to figure out a way to use it. So I think this is a really critical question for commissions. But then we have to weigh the costs and benefits to ratepayers of, stranded costs versus stranded loads. And then, state energy offices, I think you all sit at a kind of a critical nexus between public utility commissions, state DOTs and air regulators, and then also the nexus with the feds. And I think you're well positioned to help update planning processes, to maybe vet data, maybe work with EPRI to understand the truck data better, and to support this, I think, transition in planning processes. And also, obviously, lots of work you can do relating to vehicle grid integration strategies associated with light-duty transportation as well. And consumer advocates, I think that, my main advice is don't just say no. Learn how to say a qualified yes, a qualified and informed yes. I mean, I would say the California ratepayer advocates, and maybe somebody's here and wants to punch me out or challenge me later, but I think at least in this Edison rate case, their approach has been just say no. And I think, we have to remember that these trucks are hauling, diapers and dog food and dish soap. These are consumer items, and if it's cheaper to haul them in an electric truck, which it will be in the long run or in the not too distant future, that's a consumer cost too. We want to get the savings from that. So there's a trade-off. Okay, then finally, Lisa, you want me to go to questions or? Okay. Yeah, okay, so I think finally some questions you all can ask are, really, what's driving EV adoption in my state? Am I an advanced clean truck state? Will advanced clean trucks be here tomorrow? What about, do I have, really low rates, which are attracting trucks? Someone at the expo told me the other day, more than half the trucks we're selling to big national fleets that they thought they were going to send to California, they're actually sending to places like Texas because the TCO is better there and the utility can get them the capacity. You're going to need to develop scenarios for adoption in your state. We kind of know the progression across use cases, which are again, driven by some of the unique economics of your state, but there are other factors that will drive adoption. My dream is that Tesla is going to become the EV of the red states, and it's going to be revolutionary in those states. Then, what public, is there more funding than utility funding to pay for grid infrastructure, particularly for co-ops? I think, but I think also IOUs, there's some federal funds, which are a longstanding program that comes out of the rural electrification. What is it like the rural, what is it now? The Rural Electricity Service. Anyway, there are funds out there that may be appropriate. What is the state of readiness of my utilities? Is their grid already highly constrained? Are we really in a situation where we have an opportunity to make that grid much more efficient? What are the planning practices now, and what do we need to do to upgrade them to consider this new kind of load? What kinds of impacts are we likely to see here? What mitigation measures may be used successfully? Do you have, as a utility that's coming in with a rate case filing, does it have a big logistics center with a lot of these trucks? Well, then you got to ask, what kind of trucks? What are they doing? Et cetera, et cetera. And and what strategies, like some of the ones I shared with you, could be used here. And then again, back to what do we need to do to be able to incorporate some of this, some of these new really valuable data resources into planning in a way with sufficient transparency and integrity and analytic rigor. So with that, I will stop and take questions.